Nathan Intrator is the co-founder of Neurosteer, a mobile cloud-based platform that uses advanced signal processing and big data analytics to manage brain health. He's on leave from Tel Aviv University, where he's a professor of computer science and neuroscience. He develops machine learning and signal processing methods for brain-computer interface, most notably for extensive information extraction from only 2 EEG electrodes. He's a past CEO of a publicly traded asthma management company and a founder of a sonar and biomedical signal processing company. Welcome, Nathan.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to be here. Actually, the previous talk was very useful in terms of some background to what I'm going to talk about, because I am going to talk about brain neurodegenerative disorders, to concentrate on that more today. So let's get started. Hopefully. Okay, so this is what I'm bringing to the table, just one EEG channel, and trying to make it as simple, small, affordable, and usable, but medical grade. So you can ask, well, why medical grade? Why medical grade? Because I believe that even in the lifestyle and wellness, in a few years, those consumer products that will stay there will be medical grade, because no one is going to put something on their brain or try to read something that has to do with the brain unless a doctor would actually be behind that. And of course, we are realizing, because of our lifestyle and whatnot, that the wellness and lifestyle and medical condition are actually going very strongly together. So we can talk about stress at the age of 40 and 50 as a cause to some neurodegenerative disorder later. So of course, all of this is medical. And if medical, then I still need to explain why not go with the classical medical approach of using a lot of electrodes rather than using very few electrodes. And this is where mathematics, which is my background, is coming in. And I have explained that before, but I'll quickly describe that here. So if I'm going back to this multiple electrode kind of analysis, work that pretty much has been sealed in 1924 by Hans Berger, who used prehistorical signal processing tools to find out that there are few frequencies that are correlated with some brain stages and brain behavior. Then if I wanted to apply that kind of tools to try and discern between these musical instruments in the orchestra, I would not be able to. I would be able, with frequency bands, be able to discern between, say, the trumpet and the piano, but I would not be able to discern between the trumpet and the violin. But each one of us can do that, so we can use a single ear, kind of reminiscent to a single EEG electrode or EEG channel, can hear the whole orchestra in a single ear, and then decompose that orchestra in our brain, and we can very easily separate between trumpets and violins. We would say that a trumpet has a metallic sound or timbre, and the violin has a warm sound. And those that were exposed at a much earlier age to music, to classical music, can separate between a cheap violin and expensive violin, etc. And this is really what we are trying to do to the brain, okay? Why? Because different functional neural networks in the brain differ by a lot of parameters: location on the cortical sheet, topology, size of the network, length of the synapses, etc. And those create a color or timbre or minute changes to the oscillations of each such network. And this is really what we are trying to figure out. And if this is not convincing you, then I hope that you'll understand that a chorus or an orchestra of 80 billion neurons is producing a very sophisticated music that requires more advanced technology to discern. So the two papers here, which are a decomposition tool that has been known since 1750 when Fourier was developed, these are Fourier analysis, but with harmonic constraints, and not just Fourier, but actually time frequency analysis. So not the regular wavelet, but the wavelet packet analysis that was created by Kaufman in '92, and maybe some adaptation that we did on that that can actually modify the mother wavelet for those who want the technical details. So once we have discovered that, this is the device that we are looking at. And one other thing that we are kind of breaking here, and this is the first time that I'm addressing the default mode network, is the fact that we have to actually explore and interrogate the brain in order to get some information out of the brain. And if this is not very clear, then imagine that you are trying to interview a basketball player. What would you do? Keep that basketball player sitting on a chair, or would you give him a ball and try to see how he plays on the field? So the way we interrogate the brain, the questions, the challenges that we put on the brain are extremely important in order to see the response of the brain and therefore to understand what the brain is doing. Here we use earphones that are operated by the cloud, but of course we're using a lot of other ways, and we will see that. We also try to convert neurology into cardiology in the sense of creating biomarkers with numbers 0 to 100 so that it will become very, very easy to read the brain states and the brain biomarkers, and there will not be a need to look at spikes and spindles and other morphological changes that occur in EEG signals. So this is signal processing, on top of it machine learning to produce a much more interpretable brain activity. So with that said, let's look at the maps that we are creating. The first thing that makes this map very different than the classical maps or the spectral map. The spectral map, each line in the map differs by a slight frequency compared to the line before it. But there's really no connection between the geographical distance between such frequencies and the functional activity of the brain. Here, this map is actually functional, so that lines in this map are actually close functionally to one another and not close geographically. Unfortunately, this functional MRI that is presenting us geographical data is kind of confusing us to think that geographical data is really important. It is really the functional data is important. Because of this, we can talk about regions in this map. So we can talk about this cognitive region, and this is a large region. This is what I'm going to focus on today, but we can talk about the limbic region or the emotional region, and then regions that have to do with stress and other factors. So today I'm going to focus really just on this region, so from 10 to 70, and this is what we see here. And in this region, we are now looking at sub-regions of brain activity. If you want to consider this with the analogy that I put before, these are specific musical instruments or specific functional neural networks. One of them is the hippocampus that have to do with specific cognitive deficiencies or cognitive properties. And really what we are after is looking or early detecting neurodegenerative disorders. And this is why we are concentrating on those. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So please pay attention to F2, F1, and F3, and C4. These are the four that I'm going to be talking about today. And we try to validate them first with healthy subjects and later, of course, with patients. So here's an example of a map where we can see kind of no response when there's no stimulation, and now there's a visual stimulation where a person is just looking but not really observing the stimulation, and then we see the increased activity when when one is paying more attention to the stimulation. And I apologize, I'm going to present a lot of such pictures with the hope that by the end it will become very, very clear to you how to interpret these pictures. But of course, if not, please come to me. So here's one way to look at that feature that I called F3, which has to do with short-term memory. Okay, and here we see a person concentrating for 20 minutes, and we see that this area is becoming very, very red. Of course, red is more active, kind of like in the bold. So more active means higher cognitive load. In this case, a person that has, by the way, attention deficit will never have a map like this, will actually break in terms of the ability to concentrate much earlier. And how do we know that this has to do with short-term memory? So here we do the digit span task where one has to remember either 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 digits. And we see that as the number of digits goes up, namely the cognitive load goes up, we see very clearly that this region F3 becomes more red, so we can see that. And we will see soon that when people have neurodegenerative disorder, this is not helping, okay? So if I talked before about challenging the brain in order to be able to see what is going on in the brain, this is exactly what we do. I mean, if we just were using 5 digits, we would see this. But when we increase the number of digits, when we increase the load, and when we see this increase in activity, this fits a healthy brain. When we increase the load and we do not see that increase, that turns out to fit a non-healthy brain. So, by the way, that work is with Dominique Lamy at Tau. She's in psychology. Work that we've started doing with Maron Bixson and Lee Charvet in New York. Bixson is healthy subjects, and Charvet is MS patients, multiple sclerosis. And we are doing TDCS. And you see now that 10 minutes of TDCS. So here is a memory test before the TDCS. Here's the same memory test after the TDCS. And we see that 10 minutes of TDCS are actually increasing the activity in all the 4 channels that I was talking about, F1, F2, F3, and C4. F, by the way, stands for frontal. C stands for cognitive. So that has nothing to do with the electrodes, F1 and C4, etc. So I apologize if that is a confusion. By the way, the person that did the TDCS had a much better memory after the 10 minutes of stimulation. So we see a correlation between the increased activity and the increased performance of their brain. I talked about C4. C4 is that executive area. And this is stimulation, actually a week of stimulation with, in a hyperbaric chamber where someone gets much increased oxygen. And that turns out to increase the activity in what we call C4. C4 is an area that was an enigma for us until it turned out that this C4 does not exist at all with comatose patients. And so we started studying that area quite a bit. So these are 4 different comatose patients. And you can see that one thing that is common to all of them is that this area is actually not existing in all of them. By the way, they show some other disorders, which I will be mentioning again later, but this kind of smearing or multiple network activity will turn out to exist also in dementia. So it's not just in the comatose cases. There's smearing, what we call smearing in space, and smearing in time. Both of them are common disorders, one in dementia and one in coma. So statistically, there's a huge significance between non-comatose and comatose in this area. That's not surprising. I'm going to take 2 slides from previous year where I talked about epilepsy. I'm not talking about epilepsy today at all. This is just kind of to show the response of a stimulation, and the stimulation here is actually drug stimulation. It's valproic acid, one of the drugs that is being used for epilepsy. And what we see is here the drug is administered. We see that the response here is reduced compared to here. How do you read reduced? Shorter number of networks or smaller number of musical instruments playing, and the color is less red, namely they are playing more mildly. Okay, so this is the reduced response as a result of valproic acid. You can see that this is, by the way, a comatose patient. Okay, and if you are saying, well, what does that have to do with the epilepsy? Then this line, which I described last year, represents preictal activity. And what we see here is that the valproic acid, in this case, not only reduces the activity of the brain or to respond to stimulation, but also the preictal activity, which is kind of what we would like it to do. Okay, so I'm getting closer to neurodegenerative, but just before that, let me mention something about sleep. Sleep was mentioned quite a bit today, and it's a big factor in every measure of health that we can think of, and of course, it's also a potential factor in determination of an onset of neurodegenerative disorder. So with our electrode, we are producing full hypnogram in an automatic way. So in the morning after sleep, one can get the hypnogram of a person and then, of course, compare it. And one can actually evaluate the quality of a drug based on the effect of those drugs on the sleep. And of course, the reason why we need to do the full hypnogram is because this plaque that Professor Tansey was talking about is kind of being removed in the brain only during the deep sleep session. And so it's very important to see whether there is a lot of deep sleep there or not. And this is useful. So here we see very little REM. In this example, we see more REM activity. And therefore, it is quite useful. This, by the way, so I'm coming from the inflammaging group from Bologna. So this is with Pietro Cortelli in Bologna, who is dealing also with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and looking for early biomarkers related to sleep with these neurodegenerations. So let's talk about Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and frontal lobe dementia. And I have to start with a joke here. You know what the difference between an optimist and a pessimist? A pessimist says the situation is very bad, it cannot be worse than this. And the optimist says, actually, why not? And this is what happened in my case with Parkinson's. So I thought I should not be looking at Parkinson's, because why do anyone need to look at the brain when dealing with Parkinson? You put a little accelerometer on the hand, and you can tell whether the hand is shaking or not. And so I should concentrate on those neurodegenerative disorders where one cannot see it otherwise. So that was the pessimistic approach. And the optimistic approach said, just check first. And that did not come from me. It came from people who wanted me to look at this. Of course, I should not be talking about the magnitude of this problem. We heard a lot about it today. So let's jump into this. These are slides for you, Rudy, especially for you. So this is a person suffering from frontal lobe dementia. And what we see here is that when they are sitting still, the activity is extremely increased, okay? Before, we saw that only in the comatose patients. And now it turns out that when we are talking about severe dementia, we see the two disorders that are part of the common disorders, namely increased activity in all the channels. And I should have said we are decomposing 120 different functional channels from one EEG electrode, okay? From one EEG channel, we are decomposing 120 different functional components of the brain. So the smearing, when all these components are active together, that's clearly a disorder. That means the brain is not able to focus attention on one thing or another. Of course, you mentioned creation of more plaque, but I would say, first of all, these neurons are dying. This is increasing the process of cell death for the simple reason that there's not enough oxygen to nurture so many neurons active at the same time and for so long, okay? So this is also creating plaque, but clearly killing them. So we are looking at smearing in time, and we are looking at smearing in space. I didn't show the smearing in time, that this doesn't happen in healthy subjects, but I believe you will believe me. So here are 4 examples of such patients. And what turns out to be the case there is that when they are left alone, kind of not doing anything, and specifically sitting on the chair and even leaning backwards so they don't even have to balance at all, then we have this kind of activity develop, which is extremely different than healthy subjects, okay? When you give them a little bit of task, for example, to stand up, okay, or even to balance on the chair, the activity goes down dramatically. So there was one patient who had to get up and sit down about 20 times because every time someone got into the room, we had to demonstrate that this works. By the way, we see the data in real time. So the data is being processed, and you can just look at the patient and look at the reaction. And we immediately saw the effect of sitting down, sitting up. By the way, you will be amused that when they're looking at the phone, it also reduces the activity quite dramatically. So that's one reason to use the phone more often, okay? So this is the frontal lobe dementia issues. Okay, I'll skip that. And I'm going to go now to Parkinson's with your permission. And again, as I mentioned before, interrogating the brain or challenging the brain is a key to tell something about what is going on in the brain. And in the case of Parkinson's, it turns out that putting them on a balance so that each leg is on one side of the balance, that requires a very strong communication between the 2 lobes in order to balance, because each leg has to do its job. So we need fast communication and, of course, activation of the legs. And it turns out that in the Parkinson's case, there is a deficiency in this region. There's a deficiency in this region, which I called, in general, the cognitive region, when they are trying to perform this task. There's some fMRI studies that are showing that even way before the Parkinson's erupt, they can see already different pathways being formed in the brain. And this is a potential indication of exactly that, because the performance seems to be fine, although you see this deficiency. When the deficiency is bigger, and these are black lines, black arrows here showing when they are trying to do the balance. So when the deficiency is bigger, you actually see a total disconnection of the brain activity when they're trying to perform these tasks. And now the next 2 slides are very important. So now we can say, okay, what do we do? So there's a DBS, deep brain stimulation, okay? So here's a recording of a Parkinson's patient with a DBS stimulation. I'm talking about subthalamic nucleus stimulation. So these horizontal lines that you see are actually a result of the DBS. And we see here that this person is trying to perform this task on the balance when the DBS is on. We see the change in activity. At this point, the person with their little remote control is turning off the DBS and now trying to perform the same task again. And you can very easily see the difference in brain activity with the DBS and without the DBS. So first of all, it's exciting that we can record when the DBS is on, that we see the effect of the DBS. But then, of course, the next question is, well, this DBS, one can optimize the stimulation of the DBS. And the question is, well, what would that do to the activity? So the way they do it today is they do the operation. They would put a needle that is longer than what is needed, just in case they did not put it in the right place. They would have on the needle few kind of antennas so that they can actually post-operation modify the beam, the location of the beam, and the orientation of the beam. And then a neurologist will sit for something about 3 hours with the patient, look at the patient, try to modify the program, and try to ask him, do you feel better? Look at rigidity of the limbs, etc. And here, what we see is 4 different programs of that DBS. So the 4 arrows are indicating that poor patient standing on the balance during those 4 different programs. We see this one, we see this one, we see this one, and we see this one. And one can immediately suggest which program should be better, the one that reduces the deficiency of activity in that cognitive region. And I'm doing now the same mistake that we are doing with functional MRI, where we take a control group and a sick group. We realize that that sick group has a certain region of activity that is either stronger, more emphasized, or de-emphasized compared to the control group. And then we provide some neurofeedback without knowing what this region is, what this region is doing. Maybe we'll give that region a name just to sound as if we do know, but we don't really know. And it turns out that the sick group, once provided some kind of stimulation to increase or reduce that activity, actually feels better, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. So I'm comparing this to kind of more normal people and say, this looks closer to a normal person, and so I would choose this as a more optimal DBS pattern. And this turned out to be the pattern that the subject is feeling best with. So it's actually very intriguing to be able to, in real time, look at the DBS and now really optimize it. And you don't have to optimize by 4 programs. Of course, you can optimize much more in this case. By the way, this work is done in the University of Brescia with Professor Padovani and Baroni, and there's also a center for Parkinsons in Brescia that was a TV feature on us last week. So we talked too much about sick people. Let's finish with something more amusing. This is Mathieu Ricard. Mathieu Ricard is the person designated by the Dalai Lama so that his brain will be studied, because the Dalai Lama said, if you don't see scientific evidence for our meditation, we'll stop doing that meditation. So this guy has been sitting for quite a while with 256 electrodes. This is in Wisconsin, here with Stephen Lowris in Liège, and did a lot of meditation in NYU with other monks as well. And I'm very intrigued to say that we are starting to interrogate his brain while he's doing his meditation with our little device instead of 256 electrodes. This was done 2 weeks ago in Beaux-Arts in Brussels, where we recorded and showed his brain activity in real time. while he's doing his compassion meditation. So compassion was an issue that was mentioned quite a bit today. And it turns out that the brain activity during compassion meditation is totally different in comparison to the brain activity during regular meditation. So here we have some very nice way to look at this. And of course, you will say, well, why don't you show us how the brain activity looks like? And I would say, no, you'll have to wait 2 more weeks, because in 2 weeks we are going to do the same thing in Liège again. And after that, I'll show that brain activity. So thank you very much.
Very, very nice talk. Thank you. So the compassion meditation, where they go into high gamma at that point rather than theta?
Yes. So among other things, it's high gamma. But in fact, it's activating the brain quite dramatically, to the point that I thought that it could be a right meditation to actually increase activity in case of vascular degeneration or brain degeneration, because we would love to run, but if you're taking a 75 or 80-year-old person who cannot run, this seems to be activating the brain as opposed to regular meditation, which reduces brain activity. So that's kind of really very interesting.
And beyond that, with deep brain stimulation in Alzheimer's mice, if you use theta, which would be a regular meditation, you get some effect on inflammation, but if you use high gamma, very high gamma, you can actually get some of that conversion of microglial cells from the inflammatory state back to the phagocytic housekeeping state.
Interesting.
So it's interesting.
Thanks. There's another question now? Okay. Thank you very much.